I am that kind of person who enjoys solitude. The noise and chaos of city life had worn me down, and I longed for peace and quiet, far from the constant buzz of modern life. So when a friend offered me the use of his remote cabin in the mountains, I jumped at the chance. I had no idea that my search for tranquility would lead me into a real-life nightmare. The cabin was perched on a ridge deep in the mountains, miles from the nearest town. The drive up was long and winding, the road turning from pavement to gravel to dirt as I ascended into the wilderness. When I finally arrived, I was struck by the beauty of the place. The cabin was rustic but well-kept, with a sloping roof and a porch that overlooked a dense forest stretching as far as the eye could see. Inside, the cabin was cozy, with a wood-burning stove, a small kitchen, and a lofted bedroom. The walls were lined with wood paneling, and the windows offered stunning views of the surrounding wilderness. I spent the first day unpacking my supplies and gathering firewood. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. The first few nights were peaceful. I spent my days hiking the nearby trails, reading by the fire, and cooking simple meals in the tiny kitchen. The solitude was exactly what I had needed, and I felt my stress melting away. But then, things started to change. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard a faint noise outside. It was just a soft thud, like something heavy falling in the forest. I told myself it was probably a branch or a small animal, and tried to go back to sleep. But the sound persisted, a rhythmic thumping that seemed to grow louder with each passing moment. I got out of bed, my heart pounding, and crept to the window. The forest was dark, the trees casting long shadows in the moonlight. I scanned the tree-line, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the sound continued, a steady, ominous beat that seemed to be coming from deep within the woods. It sounded like someone was chopping down a tree with an axe. I was alone at night in the middle of the forest, just thinking about someone holding an axe. Inside the dark forest, outside the cabin, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The next morning, I tried to push the incident from my mind. I made breakfast, chopped wood, and planned a hike to clear my head. But the memory of the strange noise lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. The forest, which had seemed so inviting and peaceful, now felt oppressive. That evening, I decided to distract myself by cooking a nice meal and watching a movie on my laptop. The familiar routine helped me relax, and for a while, I almost forgot about the strange occurrence from the night before. But as I sat there, eating and watching, I heard it again. The thudding noise, now accompanied by what sounded like faint whispers. I paused the movie, straining to listen. The whispers were barely audible, like the murmur of distant voices. My skin prickled with unease as I realized the sound was coming closer. I stood up, my heart racing, and peered out the window. The forest was shrouded in darkness, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. But there, just at the edge of the clearing, I thought I saw movement, a shadow flitting between the trees. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the fear was real, a cold knot in my stomach that refused to loosen. I locked the doors, stoked the fire, and huddled under a blanket on the couch, but sleep was impossible. Every gust of wind outside made me jump. The whispers and thudding seemed to echo in my ears, even after they had faded away. The next day, I ventured outside to investigate. The forest was silent, the air thick with tension. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, scanning the ground for any signs of what might have caused the noises. But there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing out of place. The only thing I found was a small, smooth stone on the porch, as if it had been placed there deliberately. In an attempt to shake off the fear, I decided to go for a long hike. The sun was shining, and the fresh air and exercise did wonders to clear my mind. I took photos of the stunning scenery, picked wildflowers, and even found a small stream where I sat for a while, letting the sound of the water soothe my nerves. But as I made my way back to the cabin, the sense of unease returned. The forest, which had been bright and welcoming just hours before, now felt dark and foreboding. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches twisted and gnarled. And there, on the trail ahead of me, I saw a figure standing motionless. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure was tall and thin, its features obscured. For a long moment we stood there, staring at each other. Then, without a sound, the figure turned and disappeared into the trees. I bolted the rest of the way back to the cabin, slamming the door behind me and locking it tight. The following nights were worse. The thudding and whispers returned, louder, as if something was trying to get inside. I found more stones on the porch, arranged in strange patterns, and the sense of being watched became unbearable. I started seeing the figure through the window, always at a distance. I barely slept, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. The isolation, once so peaceful, had become a prison. I was trapped in the cabin, surrounded by the darkness and the unknown presence that lurked just beyond the trees. One night, as the thudding grew louder and the whispers filled my head, I snapped. I grabbed a flashlight and a kitchen knife. I threw open the door and stepped outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. The forest was pitch black, the moon hidden behind clouds. The thudding stopped abruptly, leaving only the whispers, now circling around me like a swarm of insects. I shone the flashlight into the trees, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But there was nothing there, just the dark, impenetrable woods. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, the figure standing just beyond the reach of the light. I spun around, but it was gone. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and I realized with a sickening dread that they weren't coming from the forest. They were coming from inside the cabin. I backed away, my heart pounding, and turned to look at the cabin. The door was wide open, swinging in the breeze. The inside was dark, the fire long since extinguished. The whispers seemed to echo from every corner, growing louder, more desperate. Terrified, I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys in my shaking hands. I didn't stop to grab my things, didn't look back as I sped down the dirt road, away from the cabin and the horrors that waited within. I never went back to that cabin. My friend asked me what had happened, why I had left so suddenly, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him the full story. I can still hear the whispers in my nightmares, still see the figure standing in the shadows, watching. Whatever was in that cabin, it wasn't human. It was something ancient, something malevolent, and it was waiting for someone foolish enough to venture into its domain alone. The isolated cabin in the mountains seemed like the perfect escape from the world, but in the deep, dark woods, where no one can hear you scream, you might find yourself facing horrors you can't explain.
If you found this story as chilling as we did, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new creepy stories.
Me and my wife had this dream of living off the grid. The idea of escaping modern life and finding solace in the wild appealed to us. So when we found a secluded piece of land deep in a valley, surrounded by the woods and far from any town, it felt like our dream had finally come true. We never imagined that seeking peace would lead us straight into a nightmare. The valley was breathtaking, an untouched slice of nature with rolling hills, thick forests, and a crystal-clear stream that meandered through the landscape. The land we bought was nestled at the base of a mountain, with the woods forming a natural barrier between us and the rest of the world. It was perfect for the life we had envisioned, self-sufficient, quiet, and utterly private. We built a small cabin ourselves, spending weeks in the fresh air, working side by side. The cabin was simple but sturdy, with a stone fireplace, wooden beams, and a large porch that overlooked the valley. During the day, the sun bathed everything in a warm glow, and at night, the stars blanketed the sky, undisturbed by city lights. It was during one of our evening walks that we first encountered him, the hermit. We had heard rumors from the locals about an old man who lived alone in the woods, but we hadn't thought much of it. The day we met him, we were walking along the stream, enjoying the crisp autumn air. The leaves had just begun to turn, and the forest was alive with color. We rounded a bend in the stream, and there he was, sitting on a large rock, his back to us. He was thin and wiry, with long, unkempt hair and a beard that reached his chest. His clothes were tattered, and he looked like he hadn't had contact with anyone in years. When he turned to face us, I saw a pair of piercing blue eyes, sharp and intense, like they had seen things no one should ever see. He stared at us for a long moment before speaking. "You're the new folks," he said, his voice rough and gravelly. It wasn't a question, but a statement. "Yes," Clara replied with a friendly smile. "We're just getting settled in. It's beautiful here, isn't it?" The hermit didn't return her smile. Instead, he frowned, his eyes narrowing. "It's beautiful, sure," he said slowly, "but it's dangerous too. This valley, it's not like other places. It has a way of getting under your skin. You might think you're alone, but you're not." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I tried to laugh it off. "Well, that's why we're here," I said. "We wanted some peace and quiet, away from it all." The hermit shook his head, his expression grave. "You should be careful what you wish for," he said. "Sometimes the things that come with the quiet aren't what you expect." With that, he stood up and walked away, disappearing into the trees without another word. Clara and I exchanged uneasy glances, but we brushed it off as the ramblings of a lonely old man. We continued our walk, talking about the work we still needed to do on the cabin and what crops we wanted to plant in the spring. Over the next few weeks, we settled into a comfortable routine. We chopped wood, tended to our small garden, and spent our evenings by the fire, reading or playing cards. But despite the peaceful setting, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The hermit's words echoed in my mind, and I found myself looking over my shoulder more often than usual. One night, as we were sitting on the porch enjoying a cup of tea, Clara pointed to the edge of the woods. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. I followed her gaze but saw nothing. "See what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "I thought I saw someone, just standing there, watching us," she said, her eyes wide with unease. I tried to reassure her, saying it was probably just a trick of the light or a deer passing by. But the truth was, I had seen something too, a shadowy figure lurking just beyond the tree line. The sight of it had sent a jolt of fear through me, but I didn't want to alarm Clara. The following days were uneventful, and we tried to get back to our normal routine. We spent our afternoons hiking, exploring the woods, and picnicking by the stream. Clara even started painting again, inspired by the natural beauty around us. For a while, it seemed like everything was back to normal, but the unease never fully left me. I started noticing small things, tools that had been moved, doors that were left open, and strange marks on the ground near the cabin. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then Clara began noticing them too. We tried to make light of it, joking that we had a mischievous ghost, but the tension between us was palpable. One evening, as we were preparing dinner, a strong wind blew through the window and blew out our candles. The cabin was plunged into darkness, and a thick, oppressive silence settled over us. I fumbled for a flashlight, my hands shaking as I tried to calm myself. During that time, the sense of being watched grew unbearable. Every gust of wind outside made me jump. Clara was unusually quiet, her eyes darting to the windows as if she expected to see something staring back at her. When we finally lit all the candles again, we both let out a sigh of relief. But the relief was short-lived. That night, as we lay in bed, I heard something outside, a faint scratching sound, like nails on wood. I held my breath, listening intently. The sound grew louder and then it stopped. I got up, my heart pounding, and looked out the window. The moonlight illuminated the yard, casting long shadows across the ground. At first, I saw nothing, but then my eyes were drawn to the porch. There, etched into the wood, were deep, jagged scratches, 3 parallel lines, as if something with claws had raked the surface. The next morning, Clara and I found more scratches, this time on the trees surrounding the cabin. They were fresh, the bark peeled away and rough, uneven strips. We searched the area for any sign of what might have caused them, but there was nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing to explain the marks. The sense of isolation now felt suffocating. We were miles from the nearest neighbor, cut off from the world by the dense woods and the steep terrain. The thought of being so far from help, with something unknown lurking in the shadows, filled me with a deep, gnawing fear. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, casting long, eerie shadows over the valley, we heard it again, the scratching, followed by a low, guttural growl. It was close, too close. Clara grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with terror. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. We stood there, frozen, listening to the sounds of something circling the cabin, its growls deep and menacing. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise itself. We didn't sleep that night. We stayed up, huddled together, listening for any sign of the creature that had stalked us. But the night passed without incident, and when the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we were left with nothing but our fear and the mysterious scratches as proof that something had been there. Over the next few days, we continued hearing the growls at night, always just beyond the edge of the light, and found new scratches in the morning. The sense of being watched grew unbearable, and Clara and I became increasingly paranoid. Every sound, every shadow felt like a threat. We debated leaving the valley, but something kept us there. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or perhaps it was the feeling that leaving would mean admitting defeat. But the fear continued to build, and the tension between us grew until we were barely speaking. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we heard a familiar voice, the hermit's. He was standing at the edge of the woods, just where we had seen the shadowy figure before. His eyes were wild, his expression one of fear and desperation. "You need to leave," he said, his voice trembling. "It's not safe here. It never was. I tried to warn you, but you didn't listen. Now it's too late." Before we could respond, he turned and vanished into the woods, leaving us alone with the encroaching darkness and the knowledge that whatever had been stalking us was still out there, waiting. In the end, we did leave. We packed up what we could and fled the valley, leaving behind our dream of living off the grid.
The forest was the place where I used to find peace. The rustling leaves, the chirping of birds, the smell of pine and earth. It's all incredibly soothing. After years of hiking through crowded trails, I wanted to find a place where I could truly be alone with nature. That's how I found myself in the heart of the silent forest, a place that lived up to its name in ways I never could have imagined. The silent forest was a remote area that few people seemed to know about, tucked away in the mountains. The drive there took me through narrow, winding roads, past old, forgotten towns, and up into the dense wilderness. When I arrived, I was struck by the sheer beauty of the place. The trees were tall and ancient, their branches forming a thick canopy overhead. The underbrush was lush and green, with ferns and moss covering the forest floor. I set up camp near a small clearing, where a stream trickled through the rocks. The air was crisp and cool, and the only sounds were the soft murmurs of the water and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was perfect, exactly what I had been looking for. I spent the first day exploring the area, hiking along the stream and marveling at the untouched beauty of the forest. That evening, as I sat by the campfire, I noticed something strange. The forest was unusually quiet. I had been in plenty of forests before, but there was always some background noise. Birds chirping, insects buzzing, the wind rustling the leaves. But here there was nothing. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that the forest was just different, maybe more isolated than I was used to. I ate dinner and watched the fire crackle, the silence pressing in around me. But as the night wore on, the quiet became oppressive, like a weight on my chest. I found myself straining to hear anything, any sound at all, but the only noise was the crackling of the fire. The next morning, I decided to go for a longer hike, hoping to find some wildlife or at least hear some natural sounds. I packed a lunch and set off down a narrow trail that wound deeper into the forest. The further I went, the thicker the trees became, their branches intertwining overhead to block out the sun. The silence was pervasive, swallowing up the sound of my footsteps and the rustling of my backpack. As I hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The trail was well worn, but there were no signs of life. No tracks, no droppings, nothing to suggest that animals lived in the area. Even the stream seemed quieter, its babbling reduced to a soft whisper. It was unsettling, but I pushed on. I was really trying to enjoy the solitude. After a few hours, I stopped for lunch in a small clearing. The silence was even more pronounced here, the air thick with stillness. I ate quickly, the unease gnawing at me. As I packed up to continue my hike, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. There were no birds in the trees, not a single one. The branches were empty, devoid of nests or movement. It was as if the entire forest was abandoned. I decided to head back to camp, the uneasy feeling growing stronger with each step. As I retraced my path, I began to notice other things that I had missed before. Strange patches of the forest floor where the moss and ferns had been disturbed. It looked as though something had been dragging through the underbrush, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. By the time I reached camp, the sun was starting to set, and the moon was casting a silver glow over the clearing. I tried to distract myself by setting up a small game to play and preparing dinner, but the silence was unnerving. It felt as though the forest was watching me, the trees closing in around my little campsite. As I was cleaning up after dinner, I heard a faint whisper carried on the breeze. I froze, straining to listen, but the whisper was gone. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced around, but there was no one there, just the empty forest and the encroaching darkness. I told myself it was just the wind, but that night, as I lay in my tent, I heard it again. The whisper was clearer this time, like someone speaking just outside the tent. I held my breath, my heart racing, as I listened to the soft murmur of voices. They were low and indistinct, but I could make out a few words: leave and stay away. I bolted upright, my mind racing with fear. The voices continued, circling the tent, growing louder and more insistent. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking, and shone it outside, expecting to see someone, or something, standing there. But there was nothing, just the empty clearing and the tall, silent trees. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up in my tent, clutching the flashlight, and listening to the whispers that seemed to move through the forest. The silence between the whispers was suffocating, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I felt trapped, surrounded by something I couldn't see or understand. The next morning, I was exhausted but determined to leave the forest. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with each passing moment. As I started down the trail, I realized with a sinking feeling that the path looked different, overgrown, unfamiliar. It was as if the forest itself had changed overnight, twisting the landscape into something unrecognizable. Panic set in as I tried to find my way back to the main trail, but every turn seemed to lead me deeper into the woods. The trees grew closer together, their branches clawing at my arms and face as I pushed through the underbrush. The whispers returned, louder and more menacing, filling my head with words I couldn't understand. The sun was starting to set, and I knew I was running out of time. I could feel the forest closing in around me, the silence suffocating. I stumbled into a small clearing and collapsed to the ground, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers were all around me now, swirling in the air like a storm. And then, as suddenly as they had started, the whispers stopped. The forest was silent once again, the oppressive quiet wrapping around me like a shroud. I looked up, my heart pounding, and saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall and thin, its features indistinguishable. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. I wanted to run, but my body refused to obey. I was frozen in place, trapped in the silence. And then, suddenly, the figure was gone, swallowed up by the trees. I don't remember how I made it out of the forest. The next thing I knew, I was stumbling down the mountain, the trees thinning out around me as I reached the edge of the woods. The whispers were gone, but the silence still clung to me. When I finally reached my car, I was shaking, drenched in sweat, and my mind was reeling from the terror of what had happened. I drove away from the forest as fast as I could, the memory of that figure haunting my thoughts. I told a few friends about what had happened, but most of them just laughed it off, saying I had probably let my imagination get the best of me. But I know what I heard, what I saw. The forest wasn't just silent. It was alive, and it didn't want me there. The silent forest seemed like the perfect place to find peace and solitude, but it became a place of terror. Sometimes, the silence of nature isn't peaceful. It's a warning, a signal that something is very wrong. If you ever find yourself in a place where the forest is too quiet, where the air is thick with tension, listen to the silence. It might be trying to tell you something.
As a freelance photographer, I'm always searching for unique locations that tell a story. Over the years, I've captured everything from bustling cities to desolate wastelands, but nothing prepared me for what I encountered at an abandoned outpost in the desert. What started as a quest for striking images turned into a horrifying experience that still sends chills down my spine while I'm writing this story. The outpost was situated deep in the desert, miles away from any signs of civilization. It had once been a military installation, long abandoned after its purpose was deemed obsolete. The road leading there was little more than a dirt track, winding through a barren landscape of sand and rock. The sun beat down mercilessly, casting sharp shadows that stretched endlessly across the parched earth. When I first caught sight of the outpost, it was a cluster of weathered buildings, their walls bleached by years of exposure to the elements. Barbed wire fences, now rusted and sagging, encircled the compound. A dilapidated guard tower stood sentinel over the entrance, its wooden beams creaking in the wind. I parked my car outside the fence and stepped into the scorching heat. The air was thick with the scent of dust and decay, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional gust of wind and the sound of sand hitting the metal fence. I felt a thrill of excitement as I slung my camera over my shoulder and made my way into the compound. This was the kind of place where history lingered, where every crack in the walls and every piece of debris had a story to tell. As I explored the outpost, I was struck by how intact everything seemed. The buildings, though weathered, were still standing. Inside, old furniture, equipment, and papers were scattered about, as if the occupants had left in a hurry. I took dozens of photographs, fascinated by the eerie beauty of the place. But as the day wore on, a sense of unease began to settle over me. The outpost was too quiet. There were no signs of wildlife, no birds, no insects, nothing. The stillness felt unnatural, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. The shadows inside the buildings seemed to stretch longer than they should, and every time I turned a corner, I felt like something was just out of sight, watching me. I tried to shake off the feeling and continued photographing the outpost, moving from building to building. The interiors were dark, the windows caked with dust and grime. In one room, I found a collection of old maps pinned to the walls, their edges curling with age. Another room housed a row of metal lockers, their doors ajar, revealing tattered uniforms and personal belongings. To take a break, I decided to set up a small camp outside the main building. I pulled out a sandwich from my backpack and sat down to eat, the vast emptiness of the desert stretching out before me. As I chewed, I couldn't help but feel that the outpost was watching me, like a predator lying in wait. After finishing my meal, I decided to explore the outpost's underground levels. I had noticed a staircase leading down into darkness earlier and had saved it for last, hoping to find something truly unique. I grabbed my flashlight, its beam cutting through the murk, and descended the stairs, each step echoing in the stillness. The basement was damp and cold, a stark contrast to the blistering heat above. The walls were lined with pipes and wires, many of them frayed or broken. As I moved deeper into the underground corridors, I began to notice strange markings on the walls, symbols that looked like they had been scratched into the concrete with something sharp. My unease grew with each step. The air was thick with a musty odor, and the sound of my breathing seemed unnaturally loud. I reached a large metal door at the end of the corridor, its surface covered in rust. With some effort, I pushed it open and stepped into a cavernous room. The room was filled with old laboratory equipment, beakers, test tubes, and strange machines covered in dust. A large, cracked window at one end of the room revealed a small, enclosed chamber beyond, with a single chair bolted to the floor. The sight sent a chill down my spine. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't just a simple military outpost. I took a few photos, but my hands were shaking. The unease that had been gnawing at me all day had turned into full-blown fear. I decided I had seen enough and started to make my way back to the surface. But as I retraced my steps, I heard something. A faint, metallic scraping sound coming from the corridor behind me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound grew louder, like metal dragging across concrete. I shone my flashlight back down the corridor, but saw nothing. Panic surged through me, and I broke into a run, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly off the walls. I reached the staircase and scrambled up to the surface, bursting out into the blinding sunlight. The desert heat hit me like a wave, but I didn't stop. I ran to my car, threw my gear inside, and peeled out of the outpost, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust. As I drove away, my mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. The sound, the strange symbols, the eerie stillness of the outpost. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite put together. The further I got from the outpost, the more I started to doubt what I had heard. Maybe it was just my imagination, fueled by the isolation and the haunting atmosphere of the place. But when I reviewed the photos later that night, I saw something that sent a shiver down my spine. In one of the last photos I had taken in the underground lab, there was a figure, faint and blurry but unmistakable. It was standing in the background, its face obscured, watching me. I stared at the photo, my hands trembling. I knew I hadn't seen anyone when I was there. I had been alone, or at least I thought I had been. The realization that something had been in the outpost with me, something I couldn't explain, filled me with a deep, unshakable fear. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the outpost, but I kept seeing that figure in the photo, its presence haunting me even in my dreams. I decided to do some research, hoping to find answers. But the more I looked into the history of the outpost, the more questions I had. The records were vague, with many details missing or classified. The only thing I could find was a brief mention of an experiment, a project that had been abandoned after something went wrong. Whatever had happened at that outpost, it had been buried, forgotten by time. But I couldn't forget. The fear had taken root inside me, and no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I knew deep down that what I had experienced was real. The photos I took that day have never been shared. They remain locked away, hidden from the world. I couldn't bring myself to look at them again, not after what I saw in that final image. The outpost may be abandoned, but it isn't empty. Something lingers there, something that should have been left buried in the desert. To this day, I don't know what I encountered at that outpost, and I'm not sure I want to. The fear of the unknown is a powerful thing. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button for more terrifying tales. Don't miss our latest video, Disturbing Farm Horror Stories Volume 2, where we uncover even more eerie and unsettling experiences from isolated farms. These stories will make you rethink the peaceful countryside. See you in the next video.